Zimbabwe, right?
Yeah, this district in the past.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, will you please take your seats? We're about to start the next session.
In Johannesburg and Cape Town.
Right.
Yeah.
It's always an effort to pull oneself away from the superior attractions of coffee and cake. But we have to get back to discussion. I would now like to call on NehemiYAH to chair the next session, which is titled Blacks as Jews / Black Jews, whatever that's meant to mean.
Good afternoon, and welcome back to our next panel on Black as Jewish and Black Jewish. So it's my pleasure to introduce the two speakers, Professor Linda Winehouse and Dr. Daniel Lees. The presentation of Dr. Daniel Lees will be on Judaizing Igbo, who is Jewish, Black Jewish, White Jewish, Red Jewish. So please.
First of all, I would like to give thanks to Ephraim Sicher for organizing this. It's a pleasure to be here again. And I think the topic is indeed very important, as Gabriel Motzkin mentioned earlier. In a few years' time, there will be more and more people from other places that say they're Jews as well. And what we are discussing here today is really very important. And there have been a great number of interesting talks, so you're probably a bit tired. So I will start with a story to as an attention grabber, so to say. An Israeli friend of mine in Switzerland told me the story. Well, you have to know she's of Moroccan Jewish and Russian Jewish origin. And her appearance, she has black curly hair, and she looks a bit of darkish. So she went to this Swiss folklore evening, and she entered a tent, and she had the feeling that all these blonde-haired, blue-eyed people were staring at her, and she felt, very dark at this moment. A week after that, she took a train late in the evening, and she enters the train, the compartment, and she sees all these black faces. Everybody is African, all men. So she's scared, and she just rushes through the train, and suddenly somebody stops her and says, "Hey, Hagan, that's her name. Don't you recognize me? We used to work together." So, but at this moment, she just felt at this white person threatened by all these black faces. So I just mentioned that to show you that blackness or whiteness is really situational, and it depends on the social context. And I would also like to think that you think for a second in this particular audience that we have here today, looking at your colleagues, how black or how white do you feel at this particular moment? Similarly, you could think right now, how Jewish do you feel in comparison to your colleagues, or non-Jewish? I mean, Jewish identity is in a way also a social construction. So we need to be aware that both of them are social constructions. I have the feeling that if we talk about blackness today in Israel, that the issue of blackness is really quite influenced by the immigration of the so-called infiltrators, Mistonanim, over the last few years to Israel. And I had actually intended to speak today more about the Igbo from Nigeria, but as my book is not yet published, I will skip most of that. Nevertheless, I will start with the end of my research about the Igbo. What you need to know about the Igbo, it's a people for about 20 to 30 million in southeast of Nigeria, where Jewish identity is quite widespread today. So it means many Igbo people identify themselves as Jews to varying degrees or identify with Jews. So I will not give you the history. Nevertheless, this Jewish identity among the Igbo can be traced back to at least 250 years back. So it's not something new. But I will start with the end of my research, which was here in Israel, when a number of Igbo people had arrived in Israel in the 1990s. And one of them, Jim Aniello, went up to the High Court to claim Jewish identity, not only for himself, but for all of the Igbo people. So he wanted to have the law of return also applied to the Igbo people. Now, there was a High Court decision in 1994, of course, rejecting the Igbo Jewish identity. And what was most interesting for me, of all the stakeholders that gave their opinion about the Igbo, I think Israeli academia was the most influential ones and not the rabbis. We always think that it is the rabbis that define Jewish identity, but I can clearly say that Africanist or Israeli academia was actually the most important factor in this. So after this avenue to Jewish identity in Israel was blocked for the Igbo, still more and more Igbo people were arriving in Israel. And so the people who wanted to get recognition as Jews, the Igbo who wanted to be recognized as Jews in Israel, had to convert to Judaism. And so they did. They built an Igbo Jewish community in southern Tel Aviv, and they converted to Orthodox Judaism, actually to ultra-Orthodox Judaism. But nevertheless, their conversions were not recognized, and most of them were deported in 2007. So halachically speaking, they were actually Jewish, but not by the state. So at the time when they were deported in 2007, it was exactly the time when more and more Africans, especially from Sudan, South Sudan and Eritrea, entered Israel through the Sinai. Among them were also other African groups, also some Igbo, but mostly Sudan, Eritrea, and Southern Sudan. So I think since then, blackness in Israel, as I've already pointed out, is increasingly identified with these groups. And you might recall, I think it was in 2012, when you then had these demonstrations in southern Tel Aviv, where people were saying, you could hear voices, "I'm proud to be a racist," and you were just waiting for the hand to get up. Now, Eli Yishai was one of he was then the interior minister. He was really trying to make a political benefit out of this political dissatisfaction with this problem, and so he called for the immediate deportation of these people and also connecting these immigrants with various sicknesses like AIDS. And this is kind of ironic, and we heard Yehuda's talk before that Eli Yishai was actually benefiting from a political heritage like the Pantrim HaShorim, the Black Panthers, that were identified with blackness in Israel. So he was really, I think, kind of whitewashing himself through his position he was taking on these immigrants. But that's not the only side of Eli Yishai. Eli Yishai was, at the same time that he was arguing for the deportation of these African migrants, he was at the same time one of the people who supported the ongoing immigration of Ethiopian Jews or the descendants of Ethiopian Jews to Israel. And there was a cabinet decision in 2010 that decided that the remaining 8,000 Falashmua, so to say the descendants of the Beta Israel who converted to Christianity, would be brought to Israel. So in a way, African Jews, yes, but non-Jewish Africans, no. But it also hints that he somehow had a different conception about race. For him, the Falashmura were of the seed of Israel. That means that he had some kind of a conception of an invisible race, yeah, that went behind color, beyond color. And that's actually also, I would say, some of the a central Zionist concept. You know, we were talking about discrimination and perceiving immigrants, Mizrahi immigrants, as being on the lower ladder. But at the same time, there was this image that people, Jews of all shades of color, would reunite in Israel and forming one body. Now, another ironic thing about this issue of immigrants from Sudan, Eritrea, and is actually that if you look at the geographic map, they're actually very, very close to where Okay. Thank you. So these people were actually coming from from an area that was very close to where the Falashmura were coming. But the difference was that one was perceived as Jewish and the other as not. Okay. So during these demonstrations in southern Tel Aviv against these infiltrators from Eritrea and Sudan, sometimes Beta Israel were attacked. So it means they were in the neighborhood and people were accusing them of being Sudanese or Eritrean, and they were being attacked. So it means that the discourse about the Mistonanim changed the discourse of blackness in Israel and was affecting the Beta Israel as well. And it's actually, I would say, this is a threat to one of the central Zionist tenets of the return of the exiles from all the places, no matter what skin color they have. So here is a next slide. This is from the mass protest in 2011, whereas in Kiryat Malachi, some homeowners refused to rent their apartments to Ethiopian Jews, and it shows that the discourse about blackness was changing in Israel, so that it more and more affected Ethiopian Jewry. It also, if you look at the picture, you can see Molat Araro painted his face white and black. And so it's also a sign that there was an emerging consciousness among the Beta Israel of being black Jews, which was actually not the case while they were living in Ethiopia. And Hagar Solomon has written an excellent article about that, about the self-identification in terms of skin color among the Beta Israel before they migrated to Israel. The picture is very complex that Hagar Solomon describes there, but among others, she says that Beta Israel actually self-identified their skin color as reddish and not black. What also happened, I think, with the immigration of Ethiopian Jews to Israel in 1984, 85, and then again in 1991, that there was somehow a disruption of the global color hierarchy. It means Beta Israel, Ethiopian Jewry, were immigrating to Israel and were made one day after their arrival Israeli citizens and part of the Israeli Jewish consensus, which means they were somehow above Israeli Arabs. Yeah, they were going to the army, they were serving in the army, so they were part of the Jewish public, which somehow it didn't happen anywhere else in the world. I'm not aware about this, and it's somehow a disruption of the global color hierarchy, which I think influences the way we talk about them today. And of course, if we talk about blackness in Israel, there is the rising discourse about Israel of being an apartheid state. And especially from the Palestinian side or supporters of them, they're strongly portraying this, trying to propagate this discourse about Israel. And the better Israel, again, are somehow disrupting this kind of argument. Of course, Israeli policymakers, I think, are also quite aware about this. And what I can see in the last couple of years, the Better Israel Ethiopian Jewry have been more and more integrated in the portrayal of Israel abroad and also in Israel as well. I mean, there is more and more Ethiopian Jews are more and more integrated in the portrayal as part of Israeli society and being a substantial part of Israeli society. And this is, you of course, probably know Miss Israel 2013 in their meeting on the occasion of Barack Obama's visit to Israel. And it's actually quite interesting that she was, this meeting between her and Barack Obama was initiated, and I think Shimon Peres played quite an important part in that, as you can see also in the picture. Now, Barack Obama. Now, Barack Obama is considered to be the first black president of the United States, which of course is also a bit problematic because is he African? I mean, he's of mixed heritage. He doesn't share the African-American experience. Nevertheless, he's considered to be the first African-American or black American president. And you might think that the issue of black African Jews would be something new to him, but then he has some family members that you probably also know. On the left-hand side, you can see Capers Fournier, Rabbi Capers Fournier. He's the cousin of Michelle Obama. He's a rabbi, and he's also the president of the Pan-African Jewish Association. There is a connection to the Igbo story as well, which I won't go into it right now, but will be in my book. So Barack Obama is well aware about black African Jewry. From the outside, as black African Jews, this discourse is very much oriented to an American discourse, to an American concept about blackness, I think. And several people have written about it. For instance, Stephen Kaplan has written articles about it. Also in one of your books, Ephraim, I think he wrote about it. So what is exactly this American discourse about blackness? And then, of course, we have to go back to blackness being somehow drawing back on slavery, and slavery drawing back on this earlier division of humanity. Here you have one of the, I have to, just excuse me for a second. This is the earliest printed example of a classical T and O map, so to say, by Günther Seiner. Conceptualization of the world being divided into Europe and being the descendants of Yefet, one of Noah's sons, Africa with Ham, and Asia with Shem. And David Goldenberg has written a brilliant book about, the title is The Curse of Ham, about how in the 7th century blackness was increasingly identified with the status of slavery, which really wasn't the case before. And then you have, of course, Europe being more and more identified as being white. And and Asia as brown, but not only brown, but also as yellow and reddish. And I think we have heard also gray today. Now that's very interesting, and I will particularly focus here on the reddish aspect of Asia, because it affects also how Jews were portrayed as descendants of Shem. If we go to the 15th century, and here we'll show you another map. This is a bit... during the 15th century and also the 16th century, there was quite a strong image about the Jews being red or reddish. And it was actually a geographical... people were quite sure that at the end of the earth, you can see it on the top of the picture, that there is a territory of the red Jews. Yes? You can find it on several maps around this time. And these red Jews were somehow threatening the Christian Europe. And the concept, of course, changed. It didn't stay the same. And you have, for instance, then in the 16th century, talk about the alliance of the red and the black Jews. And this is kind of an apocalyptic vision that would destroy Christian Europe. So again, we have here Jews described at the same time as being black and red. And I think we have this heard this earlier. I think it was in the first talk we have heard today. So I will skip to the next map. Okay. This is a map. It's one of the earliest descriptions of Africa from the 16th century. It's a map drawn by Livio Sanuto. And here you have in the middle, which is yellow, the Judeorum Terra. So from very early times, you have this idea of having Jews in Africa, black Jews in Africa, together with these red Jews in other places, be it in the Americas or be it them in Asia. So this existed at the very same time. So again, if you go back to this three-part division of the world of white Europe, black Africa, and the in-between Asia, African Jews they're somehow a disruptive element in this notion. They're like a counter discourse. At the same time, if we go then up to the Enlightenment, Jews were also somehow at the one side, so you have Jews being considered as blacks or being as reds, but at the same time, there's this idea evolving about Jews being an invisible race. So wherever you would go, Jews will have different skin colors. So if you go to Africa, they will be black like their neighbors. If you go to Europe, they will be white like their neighbors. But still, they have the same race. It means they still just marry themselves. They wouldn't marry outsiders, but they still share the same race. And this is, I talked about earlier about Ishai's conception about the Beta Israel being the seed of Israel. This is kind of a similar idea of an invisible Jewish race. And I will go to the next slide. You might have seen this before. This was from an exhibition in Nazi Germany in 1938. It was about degenerate music, like you had exhibitions about degenerate art. And here you see an interesting combination of blackness and Jewishness as being the threat to white Aryan Germany. So this is a very negative depiction, of course, of this combination of blackness and Jewishness, but you can also find at the very same time positive descriptions about this combination of black-Jewish identity. You can't see the whole picture. I say I wouldn't go much into the topic of the Igbo. Nevertheless, this is a book by a very influential anthropologist who published his book about the Igbo in 1938, so exactly the same year of the picture you saw earlier. And he writes about the Igbo. Apart from his description as having many cultural parallels with the Jews, and describing them actually these parallels in detail, George Baston, writes about the Igbo, their skin color. There are diverse degrees of color. Many Igbos are truly as black as the proverbial coal. Others are almost as light-skinned as the natives of southern Nigeria, Europe, while a few are distinctly reddish. So, today we talked about the different conceptions of how Jews were figured as black or as white or as reddish, but you can similarly find it also among other peoples. Now, for me, of course, during my research, the interesting thing was that not only have you this different perception of the Igbos as being black at the same time and red, but at the same time also being Jewish. So there's another parallel. And here, just to give you still a little idea about my research on the Igbo, you have Nigeria, and on the southeast, (2010), where you can just see also the dimension of this movement. And going back to Gabriel Motzkin, what Gabriel Motzkin said, that we really have more of discussions about these groups coming on. And there is a little advertisement for my forthcoming book. Should be out in about a month or 2 months' time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Daniel Lis. So I just forgot to tell some more about your background. So you are from Basel University of Basel, rightly. And thank you again for your contribution to this field on Jewish African Jewry. And I know that you taught about this topic in many different places, and you published widely on this topic in English and in German and in Hebrew as well. So thank you again for your contribution. So can we pick some question before moving on to the next lecture? Yeah, please. Can you move the microphone over there?
Hear
Okay.
me?
Yes.
Okay.
Better.
This just makes my folkloristic heart go pit-pat. And I wonder if you saw in the stories of the red Jews, the black Jews, it has also occurred to me with the crypto-Jewish claims in New Mexico that to some extent we may be looking at a modern variant of the lost tribes of Israel narrative. Oh, thank you. That we may be looking at a modern variant of the lost tribes of Israel narrative. And I was thinking in particular, some of you may be familiar with the legends of the river Symposium. Those are the little red Jews, they were called, living on the banks of the Symposium. So I wonder if you think it might be influenced by the lost tribes of Israel tradition.
You mean among the Igbo?
Yes.
Of course, but the discourse is also changing in Nigeria. I mean, it's if we look at how the Better Israel found acceptance in Israel, it was first Ovadia Yosef, himself being Mizrahi, and it's interesting to see that he was so influential in the decision being taken at the end. That he said not that the Better Israel are Jews. He actually said that they are from the lost tribe of Dan, which among the Better Israel is not a very widespread myth of origin. Actually, there are several other myths of origin which are much more important. Now, when the Israeli government in 1973 finally decided that they would come under the law of return, and they then immigrated to Israel, this also affected many other groups in the world that also claimed Jewish heritage or had some connection to Judaism. For instance, you might be aware of the Bnei Menashe in the borderlands between India and Burma, where also they had different myths of origin, but they were more or less accepted by Shlomo Amar, also belonging, so to say, to the Mizrahi camp of having Israelite identity. So this Israelite myth of origin also gained a lot of popularity in Nigeria. It's actually, it was existing before, but I think it particularly got strong in the 1990s, where one central figure in Igbo lore, a figure called Eri, became more and more significant. And Eri, if you go to the Tanakh, it's a son of God, tribe of God. So as the belonging, so to say, to a lost tribe of Israel seemed to be an entry point to Israel, it also became more popular in Nigeria. So yes, there's definitely like a return to this concept of the lost tribe. Also here in Israel.
Yeah, another question on that?
I was wondering, one of the, something that might be, well,
Or speak loudly. Better with the mic.
hello.
Can you introduce yourself again?
I'm Leonard Stein, Ben Gurion University. Something that was missing that we just discussed before was the idea of where does the Black Hebrews in Israeli society fit into this picture when you're talking about Blackness and Africanness. If I'm not mistaken, the movement from Chicago went to Nigeria before they came to Israel. So I'm wondering, where do they fit in your construction of their placement when you were talking about African groups in Israel and recognition, and also what Judith was just saying now in terms of claims of that narrative of being from the tribes, since they are in this, they have that contention of being claiming to be part of the original tribe, whereas others who are living in Israel, Jewish Israelis, might not be.
Mm-hmm.
Their recognition and that whole discourse.
Okay.
Doesn't need.
I mean, when looking at the Igbo case, especially at the High Court case decision on the Jewishness of the Igbo, they were referring to an earlier High Court case about the Black Hebrew Israelites from Dimona, I think from 1972, where there was also, of course, a complete rejection of their Jewishness, of having any kind of relation to the Jewish people. Among the Black Hebrew Israelites, especially if you go to the time or to earlier movements from where they came from, for quite a while, especially I think in the beginning of the 20th century, there was quite a strong self-identification among them of having a connection to the Beta Israel, because at the time the issue of the Beta Israel became more well known in the United States. Jacques Feitlovich visiting the United States and also visiting those Black Hebrew communities that already had been in existence. So they connected their Jewish identity with the Beta Israel identity. Now, the Black Hebrew Israelites, they had a hard time here in Israel. A lot of them were deported, but still people were arriving. And I think they were only able to stay here in Israel because of African-American political pressure. So I think that's why they were able to stay here. But with the immigration of the Beta Israel to Israel, and with their long-time residence here in Israel, I think the Israeli public became more ready, in a way, for Black African Jews. And I think, although the group I was working with, the Igbo from Nigeria, were deported at the end, more and more groups in Africa or in the African diaspora are identifying as Jews. It's a very strong trend, and I think one trend in Israeli society is to be to give more acceptance to these groups. That's one stream. It's one development. The other one is, of course, this evolving anti-blackness, which we can also observe. The question will be, which one is stronger? I mean, there's some integrating tendencies of integrating the Beta Israel more and more, and we always speak about the problems. But if you look at, for instance, if there is Keren HaYesod is organizing events in the Jewish diaspora, there's always an Israeli band with Beta Israel. Always. There's never an Israeli band, almost never, with no Beta Israel in it. And more and more cultural productions that are coming from Israel, it's very important that there is at least one Beta Israel there. So the picture is changing somehow. We're actually working or hoping that a project of ours will get approval, where we will investigate projects by the Black Hebrew Israelites from Dimona in African countries with the support of the Israeli Foreign Ministry. And that's like something completely new. So we can see, we have different tendencies here, and in a way, there is one tendency is clearly to give more acceptance and to understand those groups as being Jewish as well.
Thank you. More question? Yes, over there. How's the microphone, please?
Hi, my name is Danny Admaso. I'm a student in Bar-Ilan University. My question is, from what you learn, who's a Jew? This was one of your titles.
Yeah.
Is this personal definition, or it's like what you learn from it? I mean, I would like to hear your opinion. Whose definition was Jew?
Well,
your research.
My research was about, in Israel, especially looking at the Igbo case. I was looking also at their earlier identification as Jews in Nigeria, but coming to Israel, I was looking who is deciding on who is a Jew. And as I said, the general conception is that it is the rabbinate that at the end of the day decides. But the rabbinate is really relying on what I found is relying on the opinions of anthropologists, Africanists. So the rabbinate is actually drawing back on research that is being done in the academia. And that was also the case with the Beta Israel. It was the very same thing. I think academia, or scholarly research about Israel, was crucial in bringing about a recognition among the rabbis. So academia is very important. There are several actors. I mean, it's not. And sometimes it's. You wonder, why the Bnei Menashe from India got the recognition, while the Igbo not, because in my view, it's they both of them can make a case, and you can argue against it the same way or not. So it's a political issue at the end of the day. But I mean, the immigration of the Beta Israel has received a lot. Really, there's tons of research about the Beta Israel, and it's I mean, considering the number of Beta Israel that are actually in Israel, it's really amazing, you know, how much research has been done, and the awareness also of people outside of Israel about that there are Beta Israel in Israel is there. So you know, it's somehow you know, if there is one group of black Jews, well, then there are probably others as well. You know, it builds a bridge somehow.
Okay. So thank you so much, Dr. Daniel Liss. We'll skip to our next papers from Professor Linda Winehouse. On the program, you saw probably that there is a lecturer is not here today, so she wasn't able to attend this symposium with us at Van Leer. So we'll skip to Professor Linda Winehouse. You are Professor of English and Women's Studies at the Community College of Baltimore County, the state of Maryland, in USA. You have a rich academic career in the field of post-colonial and Holocaust literature, and also in women's studies in post-colonial literature. And accordingly, you are the co-author with Ephraim Sicher of Under Post-Colonial Eyes, Figuring the Jewish in Contemporary British Writing, published 2 years ago, 2012. One of your fields of expertise is modern literature of English expression, that you have published widely on authors such as Doris Lessing, Alice Munro, Nadine Gordimer, who are all Nobel Prize of Literature today. And your chapter on South African Jewish writers, the topic we'll talk about right now, will appear in your forthcoming book entitled The Edinburgh Companion to Anglophone Jewish Literature.
Okay, it's not my book, I only have a chapter.
Okay.
But it's okay, thank you,
sorry,
Yona.
yes. Mm-hmm. So the title of your presentation, Jewish Between Black and White, Jewish Identities in South African Jewish Novel.
Okay,
Please, Professor.
what do I need to do? Ma? לא, אין לי. לא, אין לי. Okay. Okay, first of all, my paper is based on the literature of white South African writers, so I beg the indulgence of all the anthropologists and sociologists and historians in the room. It is my intention to discuss a few representatives of South African Jewish novels in a historical context, and to demonstrate the ways in which Jewish identity is constructed in them over time, and hopefully to give a context to discuss the construction of South African Jewish identity today. Since South African Jews who came to South Africa were initially from an Anglo-German background, and then later in increasing numbers from Eastern Europe, since they began as peddlers and store owners and progressed in the second and third generation to lives of great professional and economic success, since they encountered social and institutional barriers that were later to a large extent overcome, many argue that the story of Jewish life in South Africa was no different from Jewish life elsewhere in the diaspora, especially in England and the United States. Yet, however similar Jewish life in South Africa is to Jewish life elsewhere, from earliest times it was determined by their somewhat enigmatic position within the Boer-Brit-Black axis. The history of South African Jewish literature in the 20th century can be usefully divided into pre-apartheid and apartheid and post-apartheid. The first period was characterized by anxiety occasioned by the large immigration of Jews from Eastern Europe. And we've heard quite a number of people mention today the attitude toward the Ausjuden, right? For many of these immigrant Jews were regarded as not possible to, it wasn't possible for them to assimilate into European South African society, and consequently in the South African context, not white. The writer The writer Sarah Gertrude Millen was born on March 19, 1889 in Lithuania, like so many South African Jews, and her family settled on the banks of the Vaal River in the Kimberley area, where her father opened a trading store. They lived in an isolated area near the diamond diggings in Kimberley, where there were very few whites, and they felt surrounded and threatened by the colored population there. When I use the word colored in this paper, I'm using it in the South African meaning of descendants of mixed race. A dominant theme in Millen's work, especially in her best-known novel, God's Stepchildren, 1924, is the evils of miscegenation. Some interpretations of Millen's work see her anxiety regarding miscegenation as a screen for the widespread concern in the Jewish community regarding their status as whites. In God's Stepchildren, Millen disparages the children of parents of mixed race while emphasizing the fears of those colored who appear white. Barry, the protagonist of God's Stepchildren, dreaded that some white person would feel that he, quote, was not as he was, and searching discover why. Sometimes he even wanted to say right out and have done with it. Look here, I must tell you, I'm not really white. At this time, Jews were scorned by both whites and blacks because as the owners of concession stores that served blacks, they were considered exploiters by the blacks. In Rhodesia, they even had a special name for Jews, Majuta. And white Kafirs by the whites. In the novel The Coming of the Lord, 1928, Millen deals directly with the way in which both whites and blacks disparage Jews. The protagonist, Saul, becomes a doctor, he's a Jew, becomes a doctor, and aligns himself with the one black doctor, Tetiana. Durden, the Afrikaner, had the same feeling about Saul that the poor whites had about the native doctor, Tetiana. He credited him because he was alien with mysterious power. As for Tetiana, when Saul offers him friendship, he would have preferred if it had not been a Jew, for a Jew had not the same standing as another European of his own kind. The Jews' fears of exclusion were exacerbated by the Nazi sympathies of the National Party prior and during the Second World War. In 1937, Millen made a speech in which he declared, "The Jews oppose discrimination because they fear discrimination against them. In South Africa, this means miscegenation." Ironically, once the nationalists come to power, their attention is primarily focused on the country's mounting racial problems, and then the Jews' status as privileged whites was ensured. They are needed to bolster the white position. When Jews were included in white South Africa, Jews responded by seeking invisibility and by trying to de-emphasize and suppress the memory of Afrikaner anti-Semitism. Throughout the years of apartheid, Jews desired to fit into white South African society, which meant that as a community, they did not officially oppose apartheid. Though a disproportionate number of what Gideon Shimoni calls deviant Jews were active in the anti-apartheid movement. Most Jews, however, occupied a position between these two polarities. They were prominent in the respectable bodies and activities which opposed the government. Writing in the 1960s, Dan Jacobson reflects the predominant temper of the Jewish community under apartheid that was non-observant but largely affiliated, Zionistic, haunted by the specter of the Holocaust, and still subject to anti-Semitism in South Africa. Jacobson's parents were not particularly religious, but his father insisted that the children attend Hebrew lessons and the synagogue as an assertion of identity as the Nazi madness swept across Europe. In his autobiographical essay, My Jewish Childhood, 2000, Jacobson's description of growing up Jewish in South Africa in the 1930s and 40s, he bitterly remembers the endemic anti-Semitism of the time. Quote, "Growing up Jewish, I believe, encouraged many of us to feel a quasi-instinctive sympathy with other despised and unjustly treated racial groups in South Africa. In the overwhelming majority, the members of the Jewish community accepted this dispensation. Yet, of the Jewish boys in my school, I never heard them using the violent and abusive language against people of darker skin that was common coin. The fact remains that the bad thing that probably embraces all others was the anti-Semitism of a violent kind and of epidemic proportions that was abroad during my boyhood. In his semi-autobiographical novel, The Beginners, 1962, Jacobson wrote of the discrimination experienced by Jews of his generation, the effects of the Holocaust on their lives, and of the benevolent attitude of many Jews towards blacks. When in the same month as the declaration of the independence of the State of Israel, the Afrikaner nationalists came into power in South Africa, the protagonist of Jacobson's novel, Joel Glickman, decides to leave the country for Israel. Joel leaves first for Israel and then later to England as an escape from, quote, the haphazard disorder and fortuitousness of the country of his birth, towards which he feels estrangement, pity, guilt, fear, contempt, roused at one time or another by every group in it, the blacks, the coloreds, the Indians, the Afrikaners, the English, the anxious, prospering Jews, held together only by their needs and greeds, with no other shared ties of history, culture, kinship, loyalty, or even human sympathy. In Jacobson's works, the only relationship between whites and blacks is a master and servant relationship, though his Jewish characters are frankly critical of the system that fails to treat the black man as a human being. In his widely anthologized short story, The Zula and the Zeta, Jacobson suggests that there might be a natural affinity between Jews and blacks. A young Zulu, Paulus, is hired by a Jewish family to look after their senile father. Jacobson writes of the touching connection that evolves between the old man and his caregiver, despite their racist environment. Quote, the young bearded Zulu and the old bearded Jew from Lithuania walked together in the streets of the town that was strange to them both. Neither Paulus nor old man Grossman were aware that when they crossed the street, hand in hand, there were white men who averted their eyes from the sight of this degradation, which could come upon a man when he was senile and dependent. Thus, Jacobson reveals the unbridgeable gap between white and black South Africans unless the white man happens to be old, senile, dependent, and in this case, Jewish. Nadine Gordimer, whose career spans, and you and I didn't only pick authors that got the Nobel Prize, whose career spans the apartheid and post-apartheid era, fully articulated at length what was and would continue to be her primary focus as a South African writer in an interview in 1965 with Alan Ross. She said, a white South African brought up on the side on the soft side of the color bar, I have gone through the whole package deal evolution that situation has to offer. Unquestioning acceptance of the superiority of my white skin, questioning of these attitudes as I grew up and read and experienced, and finally, rebirth as a human being among other human beings, which all this means in the face of discrimination that sorts them into colors and races. Whether I like it or not, this has been the crucial experience of my life. I have no religion, no political dogma, except my conviction that the color bar is wrong and utterly indefensible. Nonetheless, though Gordimer's main focus has been on the color bar, she has written about Jewishness in her essays and novels, which reveal an internalization of anti-Semitic stereotypes. In her essays about her father, and in the fictional characters who resemble him, she harshly criticizes those shopkeepers who, like her father, embraced the mores of white supremacy out of their own sense of inadequacy. In her essay in The New Yorker, entitled My Father Leaves Home, 1990, she denounces her father because, quote, he shouted at the black man on the other side of the counter who swept the floor and ran errands, and he threw the man's weekly pay grudgingly at him. I saw there was someone my father had made afraid of him. She also explains the source of her feelings of disdain towards her father and towards Judaism. If the phylacteries and skullcap were kept somewhere, we children never saw them. He went fasting to the synagogue on the Day of Atonement, and each year on the anniversaries of the deaths in that village of the old people whom the wife and children had never seen, he went again to light a candle. Feeble flame, who were they? In the quarrels between husband and wife, she derided them as ignorant and dirty. You slept like animals round a stove, stinking of garlic. You bathed once a week. We children knew how low it was to be unwashed. And whipped into anger, he knew the lowest category of all in her country, this country. You speak to me as if I was a kafir. Gordeman maintains the stance of an outsider, a spectator towards her father and the legacy he carries. In her early and most autobiographical novel, The Lying Days, 1953, the Gentile protagonist, Helen Shaw, shares many aspects of Gordimer's own journey towards becoming a human being among other human beings. The Jews in the novel are all described in stereotypical fashion, and most of them are depicted as ugly and at times not even human. Through Helen's eyes, we see her Jewish friend Joel Aaron's father, who owns a Jew store at the mine, as an ugly, short man, his wife having puffy hands with hardened flesh growing up around unkempt nails, her body in a cheap silk dress, the body of Jewish women from certain parts of Europe, the swollen doll's body. Her movements were like a horse, and the old man at the Aarons' home has the face of an old dog. Two of Gordimer's novels, A Sport of Nature, 1987, and No Time Like the Present, 2012, have Jewish protagonists who are portrayed positively after having escaped, overcome, or rejected their Jewish background through an identification with Black liberation. In A Sport of Nature, Hillela becomes an ambassador's mistress, then the second wife of a Black cadre in the movement for Pan-African liberation, and eventually, after his murder, the wife of the leader of a newly independent African nation. Even in this novel, however, there are traces of the negative depictions of Jews we have seen in Gordimer's early works. For example, as Pauline, Hillela's aunt, grows older, the narrator relates that she lifted her head 2 streaks of gray, now at the hairline, like mosaic horns. In No Time Like the Present, which takes place in the new South Africa, Gordimer depicts contemporary expressions of Jewish separatism as a variant on the ethnic and racial divisions that would be better overcome in the rebuilding of the nation, while revisiting the lack of support that had been shown in the community for Jews who were involved in anti-apartheid activities. The main characters are an interracial couple, veterans of the struggle, Jabulil, who is Black, and Stephen Reed, whose mother is Jewish. Stephen's brother Jonathan, who has enjoyed a privileged lifestyle under apartheid, now explores his past and his identity in its aftermath. He holds a bar mitzvah for his son, a celebration Stephen views as inexplicable since they had no religion growing up, besides for their circumcision, a condition which is obsessively mentioned in the novel and which is described as some atavistic whim of their mother. Jonathan explains his gesture towards Jewishness as follows: "It isn't enough to be Black or white, finished and clad the way it was in the bad old days." Our sympathy for Jonathan and his non-Jewish wife, Brenda, however, is forestalled since Gordimer makes it clear that they would have nothing to do with Stephen during the bad old days when he was on the run from the authorities, though they, like so many whites, Jews and non-Jews, suffering from amnesia, now claim that they were not personally involved in the bad years except in being white. Stephen, for his part, asserts Jabu's superiority to them, to him, and in her history, to any but exterminated Jews or Arabs. No Time Like the Present reflects a number of ways in which Jewish identity is now being reconstructed in light of the fall of apartheid and rising conflict over the Israeli-Arab conflict. Some Jews turn to Judaism to define their identity, while others, often the children of anti-apartheid activists, confront the community with complaints against the way their parents were treated. The new Jewish writers in South Africa began writing in the 1980s, when the regime was most oppressive in reaction to the rapid crumbling of apartheid, and continued writing into the 1990s and beyond, reflecting its end and aftermath. Since the fall of apartheid, South African Jewry has struggled mightily with the record of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies that worked along with the apartheid regime, and the widespread support for Israel's military and security ties with apartheid South Africa. The controlling metaphor in Tony Espril's aptly titled novel, The Persistence of Memory, 2004, is the perfect preternatural memory of the Jewish protagonist, Paul Sweetbread, in the land of national dysamnesia. Espril's struggle with his role as a Jew in the South African army is one aspect of the particularly Jewish struggle with the legacy of apartheid. After the collapse of apartheid, Paul testifies before the Truth and Reconciliation Committee regarding his participation in the massacre on orders from his racist, anti-Semitic commanding officer, Captain Liddy, of retreating People's Liberation Group troops. His ability to totally recall the events is an analog for the charge of the committee. Yet, to underscore the limitations of the ability of the Commission and post-apartheid South Africa to confront the past, his testimony is discredited by his psychiatrist, who claims that Paul's discovery of his father's suicidal body as a child caused him to have delusions of memory. Like Gordimer in No Time Like the Present, Esprill notes that the move towards ethnic and religious assertiveness taking place in South Africa today, despite the official move away from identity politics. That was the end of the sentence, sorry. Towards the end of The Persistence of Memory, Paul considers changing his name, or as he says, returning to my roots. It's all the rage among my coevals to Hebraicize, and Saul Schwarzbart has a nice dignified sound to it. I could be my own grandfather. Paul's suffering in the army under his anti-Semitic commander, combined with his guilt over the role he was forced to play in it, leads him to a crisis of identity. As Paul remarks, who is Paul Sweetbread? A nice Jewish Christian boy, a liberal soldier in the army, a lousy good South African, a var Sud-Africana Englishman? Can such a person even exist? Novels written by South African Jews throughout the 20th century reveal that when the colonial government in South Africa was threatened socially and economically by an influx of Eastern European Jews, Jews were not considered white, and their close connections with blacks was deplored. Some Jews at that time, in an attempt to distance themselves from such an association, decried any taint of miscegenation. Some writers internalized the prejudices against them, describing Jews as ugly and unwashed. When the nationalist government perceived itself as an embattled minority, Jews became white, and Jews became invested in maintaining that identity. A sampling of books and articles written by South African Jews from the 1980s to the present testifies to the wide range of Jewish responses to apartheid's decline. Claudia Brody, in her article, From the Brotherhood of Man to the World to Come, traces rabbinic literature in South Africa, claiming that South African rabbis responded to the anxiety and terror during the state of emergency in the 1980s by becoming apolitical, inward-looking, and mystical. The Zionism that was encouraged by the segmentation in South African society and its emphasis on the separate development of different cultural and ethnic groups has been losing ground in a climate in which ANC leaders often express pro-Arab and anti-Israel sentiments. The ANC supports the application of apartheid discourse against Israel, as we see in its endorsement of BDS in 2012 and of the IAW this year. There has also been an increase in strict Orthodox observance. It is hypothesized that the rapid transformation and the insecurities created by social changes in South Africa after 1994, as well as increased levels of crime, pushed more Jews to embrace the global trend towards greater religious observance. Some Jews had thought that the new South Africa would signal a movement away from separatism. For instance, Albie Sachs, in his memoir, The Soft Vengeance of a Freedom Fighter, 1990, described a multiracial ideal for the new South Africa and postulated that the end of apartheid signaled the end of the importance of differences between races and ethnic groups. Instead, the changes have caused some South African Jews to lament that, quote, South Africa's transformation to democracy has not seemed to open up the community to new possibilities, but has instead made it more inward-looking and insular. This contradiction is evident in an article by Oren Steyer on the South African Jewish complex, in which he analyzes, that's a complex like buildings, not a complex like an obsession. Okay, but I like the double entendre, actually. Anyway, Steyer analyzes the proximity of South Africa's Holocaust Center that opened in Cape Town in 1999 to the South African Jewish Museum that opened in 2000. The Holocaust Center contains a display on anti-Semitism in South Africa in the 1930s and 40s, and establishes a link between Afrikaner anti-Semitism and the racist ideology of Nazism. The South African Jewish Museum, however, asserts a commonality with the white minority's shaping of the country's economic growth. Steyer's discussion of these institutions shows the way contemporary expressions of Jewish identity and Jewish representation in the post-apartheid era must grapple with the contradictory history of power and powerlessness in the life of the Jewish community in South Africa.
Thank you, Professor Linda Winehouse. We can now open the floor to question, discussion, or debate on this very interesting topic. You want to pick the microphone first?
Uh-oh, Ephraim.
That was a question, I think. Over there.
Could you just say something briefly about contemporary South African Jewish novels?
So there's a few different things. First, there's the example I gave of Espril, who's looking at the legacy of, what they had to serve in the army and what it meant growing up Jewish in South Africa. There are also other writers who deal with the situation, the crime situation in South Africa. There's one, I'm not going to think of the name right now, but it's about two Jewish men who own a furniture store in Johannesburg and how they're staying in the bad neighborhood, even though most of their Jewish clientele has disappeared, and how they're robbed like every other day. There are also novels that maybe are similar to what Claudia Braudy is talking about in terms of the mystical element in Jewish writing. Again, I'm sorry, I don't have it written down. I won't think of it right now, but there's a Sephardic Jewish writer who writes about Italian Jews living in South Africa, and it's very mystical. And also there are Jewish writers who are, I guess you would describe them as transparent. I'm thinking of a writer like this writer, I do remember Damon Galgut, who is a Jewish writer, but you cannot tell from his writing that he is a Jewish writer. There's nothing to identify him as being particularly Jewish, either in his own statements about himself or in his novels. And he's quite famous in South Africa today, and also outside of South Africa, and has quite a number of novels, and the most famous is called The Good Doctor. And he's definitely dealing with the post-apartheid era and the legacy of apartheid, but not from a Jewish perspective at all.
Question?
There was a question in the back? No?
I would have a comment. I think it's interesting what you noted about the inward-looking Jewish community in South Africa. And I think we talked about this earlier, but I forgot his name now, but there is a group of South African black Jews, the Lemba.
Yes.
And you would find probably similar tendencies in their writings. I'm thinking of one particular author whose name I forgot right now, but I think this inward-looking. Yeah, you could also find.
It's in South Africa. Then I don't know if people heard about it, but the chief rabbi in South Africa this past year, made a big campaign that all the Jews in South Africa should observe Shabbat for one time. And it was like a mass movement. And I think, people were signing up online and you could get matched with a family to observe Shabbat. And I think maybe it's part of this, now a return, a more of identification, kind of ironically, in the post-apartheid era with Jewish identity, and even in terms of religious observance.
I have a question too. In the field of artistic performance, do you think that South African Jewish produce something reflecting this period of apartheid in South Africa in the different performance?
Well, probably Gordimer is the best example. I mean, as I mentioned, her interest was really the color bar, right? Her interest was really the injustice of apartheid. And so she has a long career. She wrote many books, and each book chronicles a different period of time. So when there was, it seemed like there would be some chance of cooperation between blacks and whites in South Africa. She has a novel that depicts that. And she has, so each stage in the, it wasn't like a monolithic time, the apartheid era. It lasted for a long time. And each stage along the way, she has a novel to depict it.
Was another question over there?
Yeah.
Yep.
I wonder if you could comment on any parallels that you might see in American literature, American Jewish literature. I'm thinking of Bernard Malamud's *The Tenants* and Mr. Samler's *Planet* by Saul Bellow, and other novels of the late '60s, which strike me, Jewish novels and writings like Philip Roth's short story *Epstein*. They strike me as perhaps having a parallel to this moment of a breakdown of a possible romance, a black Jewish romance, not a personal romantic involvement.
No, I know what you mean.
Yeah.
I know what you mean.
And in the aftermath of competing nationalisms and of growing urban problems, the full nature of incompatibility becomes more apparent than it had before. Some of the things you referred to, I don't know, sparked that recognition. I wonder if you've thought about that.
I'm not. I don't know all that much about American Jewish writers, even about American writers. But I think that what I was thinking about when you were asking the question is a movie like The Pawnbroker, for instance. Right.
The Pawnbroker, which was a novel by Wallace. That's right.
Right. Okay. And definitely when I do this work, I think a lot about Philip Roth. Even this whole business of the anxiety about passing, and I'm thinking of The Human Stain, for instance, right, where when the black person wants to pass, he chooses to be a Jew, right? So the kind of intermediate position of the Jew in a racially divided society, definitely.
So it was a debate, and thank you, both of you, for your presentation. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Without any further ado, we'll go on to the next session. I think we are actually running a little ahead of time, incredibly, for conference, which means that we'll have a little bit more time for discussion at the end. And I'd like to call on Professor Emily Buddig, who is Chair of English at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, to chair the next session.